Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of our reading series, Time Sensitive. My name is Becca Liu, and I co-organize the series with Ethan Plaue. Time Sensitive explores the time-making practices of poetry, performance, and multimedia art. Time Sensitive recurs on a yearly basis. Tonight, I have the great pleasure of introducing the academic and practicing artist Denise Ferreira da Silva. Her work addresses the ethical political challenges of the global present. She is the author of Toward a Global Idea of Race, A de Vida Impagable, and co-editor of Race, Empire, and the Crisis of the Subprime. Her several articles and essays have been published in leading interdisciplinary journals such as Social Text, Theory, Culture, and Society, Social Identities, Philosophia, Griffith Law Review, Theory and Event, The Black Scholar, to name a few. Her artistic works include the films Serpent Rain, Four Waters, Deep Implicancy, and Soot Breath, Corpus Infinitum, in collaboration with Arjuna Newman, as well as the relational art practices, Poethical Readings, and Sensing Salon in collaboration with Valentina Desideri. She has exhibited and lectured at major art venues, including the Pompidou Center, Whitechapel Gallery, Guggenheim, and MoMA. Professor Da Silva's groundbreaking critical work has not only illustrated how the excommunication of racialized figures orders and arranges post-Enlightenment ways of knowing and experiencing the world. She has also explored how the very violence that these epistemologies require can, in turn, refract and force the disarrangement of the ordered world. In an article on aesthetic thinking and Black study co-authored with Rizvana Bradley, Professor Da Silva writes, quote, "If the ordered world secures meaning because it is supposed to be knowable, then Blackness returns existence to the expanse. In the wreckage of space-time, corpus infinitum," end quote. Please join me in welcoming Denise Ferreira da Silva.
Thanks, Becca, for this very, very kind introduction. And thank you and Ethan for the invitation to be part of this series. And thanks, Zach, for the text support. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to put up here now because I open this with a quote. With a quote from Adrian Piper. And it's an answer that she gives to a question about members of the public commentary on the meaning or on their inability together to grasp the meaning of one of Piper's installations. And she says, there is no single core message. The work uses language as one medium among many, but its meaning cannot be compressed into language or exhausted by language. You have just to go in, walk around, look, listen, read, and smell. If you're patient, willing to receive on multiple channels, and go on thinking about it afterwards, it will all come together eventually. End quote. How to read this invitation? Try and don't approach the artwork in search of its intrinsic, unique, or deepest meaning. How to instead approach it as something that it's there, that exists, something to be listened to look at, to read, and to smell. And also, instead of trying to apprehend, comprehend, or explain it after taking it in, why not wait on with it, and wait as it does or does not come together eventually. So what I have to share with you, this set of notes I'm sharing with you today, responds to this invitation from Piper. After it's all said, is a reference to the preoccupation with meaning, that preoccupation from Piper's audience. From the public, but it's mostly to signal that an interrogation of the critical as an intellectual endeavor also animates the general proposition here. So as I'm presenting what I am presenting, those notes, I would locate them in something that I think BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and also LGBTQ2+ artists expose when they confront the critical, right? this Kantian heritage. And yes, I am here recalling this heritage and finding it again significant to go after, to confront. And why even bother? Well, why bother? Because of critique, because of that which is in the past century gave any sense to occasions like this one, my talking with you, to give any sense to this in the context of the university where we are meeting now, even though we are meeting remotely. Bother because of critique, and because we must recall what critique the task, critical the project, and criticism in the art context, what they all have in common. Because if critique is the task of identifying and exposing the grounds, the rational principle guiding a particular knowledge apparatus, and if criticism is the task of evaluating creative works according to a rational principle, combining the two becomes a straightforward exercise only, and if only one can ignore that both rely on the assumption that they are based on the assumption that rational in both means and refers to the same thing. That same assumption, one of many elements of our shared Kantian heritage, I think I can say with that without concerns. This assumption also underlies the idea and the different renderings of critical theory, and also of critical theory's trust in its own capacity to explain and to intervene in social life. So by mentioning this commonality, I want to signal from the outset my interest in having what's composing, what I'm presenting, what this composition I'm presenting to you as a contribution to a consideration of criticism and critical theory, both in regards to all of those moments, in regards to knowledge, to art, but also of critical social theorizing. But critical social theorizing that is directed to and promise and hopes to, affect social collective existence. Now, however, how this talk has come together and what it hopes to do, what this assembling hopes to do, as far as the critical task is concerned, departs from the other sense of the task of criticism and critique, precisely because it challenges what holds them together, which is what comes under the term rational, which includes, of course, a kind of mental gesture at work in aesthetical, analytical, and theoretical statements. That mental gesture, evaluation, or judgment both presumes and institutes meaning as well as a context, and something like its production and the tools for that presentation, apprehension, and comprehension. And that is both the context, the target, and the material for what animates these assemblages I'm sharing with you. More explicitly, these gestures presuppose the figure of the the subject of the understanding, which is at the core of aesthetic, scientific, analytic, or theoretic, but also of ethical, right, of moral judgment. So this is, the ruling figure of the ontopsemological regime that has been on for the past 200 years or so. So the goal, the contribution here is to the goal of still dissolving this figure in all its manifestations. Of course, this is its task and it's a collective one. And what I'm presenting today, those notes just gather pieces of something with which I would like to contribute to this task of breaking down the Kantian program in all its appearances, which I think will take certainly the break apart of the different manifestations of the form of the transparent eye. And that breakdown requires several things. One of them, the one that I'm covering here, is the rescuing of sensibility from the formal enclosures of the Kantian and the formal temporal enclosures of the phenomenological presentation of subjectivity. Of course, these can take different forms, including an analysis, a resolution of subjectivity in such a way as to expose the sutures and ruptures, the thinking elements that render the manner through it is both distinguished and separated from sensibility, while at the same time that it becomes that which delimits the terms and delimits it, subjectivity. So note 1.0, sensibility and subjectivity. I have another long quote, and just to give you the context that what I'm attempting to display, which is the formulation of the aesthetic. One of the presentations is this one, and it's a long quote. Be patient. And an aesthetic judgment in general can therefore be explicated as that judgment whose predicate can never be cognition, concept or of an object, although it may contain the subjective conditions for a cognition in general. In such a judgment, the determining ground is sensation. However, there is only one so-called sensation that can never become a concept of an object, and this is the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. This is merely subjective, whereas all other sensation can be used for cognition. There's an aesthetic judgment that whose determining ground lies in a sensation that is immediately connected with the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. In the aesthetic judgment of sense, it is that sensation which is immediately produced by the empirical intuition of the object. In the aesthetic judgment of reflection, however, it is that sensation which is the harmonious play of the two faculties of cognition, the power of judgment, imagination, and understanding produces in the subject insofar as in the given representation of the faculty of the apprehension of the one and the faculty of presentation of the other are reciprocally expeditious, which relation is in such a case produces through this mere form a sensation that is the determining ground of a judgment, which for that reason is called aesthetic, and as subjective purposiveness without a concept is combined with the feeling of pleasure. End quote. So obviously I'm not going to spend any time over this of the Kantian conception of the aesthetic judgment. But I just want to say that how it's important here. And I'll do so just by focusing on sensibility and subjectivity in the Kantian program. So basically I'm extracting or repeating what it is in that quote, but in the ways in which it makes sense to me and interests me. So sensibility, refers to the moment of engagement with the things of the world as a moment of knowledge that is an experience in which, the moment in which these things affect the human and they affect the human as appearances, that is, as already apprehended by the pure transcendental intuitions of space and time. So formalization in logical terms, not physical one, here is a crucial step as it interiorizes knowing as only possible due to something that resides in the mind, in the human mind, and there alone. And subjectivity here refers to the how of this engagement with impressions or representations of the things of the world, which also include other humans. Again, but through the most fundamental formal mediator, which is that of the pure intuition of time, as a determinant of the inner sense, as well as of the unification of appearances and their representations under concepts, and that which supports the Kantian statement that knowing is but determinacy. So my plan, as I go after these two formulations and try to extricate, as part of the project of extricating sensibility from subjectivity, from its realms, from its context, that it's time, and from its function, that is determinacy. So my plan opened with a question. So what framing of the static becomes possible when it encompasses both the experience of the perceptible and the imperceptible? Would it remain a matter of judgment, which is fundamental in all three modalities of critique, right? In the critical criticism and criticality, and as it has become since Kant's formulation of what has become its, the articulation of the static. What becomes of experience itself and sensibility itself if the perceptible and the imperceptible are taken into account? What happens to sensibility when, in addition to that which reaches the senses, it also included what occurs to the very composition of what happens and exists, to the very ways in which things are put together materially. So what I do in these notes is to speculate on the possibility for an approach to what falls under what's named aesthetic, an approach which, instead of the current formal assumptions, entertains a proposition for the sensible corresponding to an image of existence that gives the haptic and the sonic the same weight as the optic. I'll go back to the PowerPoint and then I'll just stay there. So, and this has been inspired by a question suggested by Sunny Kerr in the description of Drift, Art and Dark Matter, an exhibition which opened a year ago at Queen's University's Art Gallery, Agnes Etherington in Kingston, Canada, and also was here at UBC, at UBC's The Belkin Gallery in the past fall. And the question, and Sunny's question is how to study a known unknown. So my short itinerary here basically comments on this question, and it begins by emulating Kant's building of his own program on early classical physics, right? But not in the same way. But for the most part, I'm basically wondering about other bases for thinking as I try to a kind of sense making that takes dark matter experiments at Snow Lab, which is the place where the artists were, which is this physics research facility located in Eastern Canada. And I take these experiments as an inspiration for a departure from the image of existence that mediates our approach to what exists and what happens, and at the level of the common sense. And in doing so, I'm particularly moved by the fact that the scientists are attempting to capture something simple that happens all the time, everywhere, to everything, anything that has material existence. But then, of course, I'm not interested in the truth statements that their experiments will yield or not. What interests me is what their findings and descriptors their descriptors offer in terms of the critical task of exposing the limits of and the limitations imposed by post-Enlightenment thought. And also, obviously, the radical task of releasing existence and events from these and opening the possibilities for thinking otherwise. 1.1, the known and in the unknown. Many experiments taking place at Snow Lab are devoted to the identification of still theoretical elementary particles called WIMPs, weakly interacting massive particles. And these particles would explain as the cause for cosmological observations, which are not accounted for by the known visible matter found in the cosmos, in the universe. Because whatever causes these events has mass, it is matter, but it does not interact with the electromagnetic spectrum. it has received the qualifier of dark. It is dark matter because it doesn't interact with light. So these cosmic events are registered as gravitational effects on the size and spinning of galaxies, and also the bending of light, which do not seem to result from interactions among observable matter. So the experiments at Snow Lab are carried underground to avoid the interference of solar and other kinds of radiation. And they are designed to capture dark matter by detecting, sensing the effect of the WIMPs, if they exist, on the composition of solid or liquid materials. And these effects would be at the atomic level and the subatomic level. Taking one of these experiments, which is done with solid matter as a point of departure. So I have this outline of what I'm calling now, I may change the name for it. I'm calling material statics, indirect confrontation, and hopefully in violation, which is presented hopefully in violation of Kant's formal aesthetics. And it's very simple as an exercise. So I take an approach to what exists or happens, suggested by how Snow Lab physicists and cosmologists attempt to discover the composition of what amounts to 27% of the universe. And that is my point of departure for speculating on the formulation of the aesthetic, that it's not premised solely on visibility. So how is it that something that's known to exist because of what it makes happen to the largest cosmic composites, galaxies, is supposedly to become known through the observation of what it may make happen to the tiniest composites, if these are placed as deep as possible in the entrails of the planet. Experiments searching for the dark matter particles are held deep underground or in mountains in radiation-free labs. Snow Lab experiments, unlike the well-known ones carried out in the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, such as ATLAS, which is the one that discovered the Higgs boson. The Snow Lab experiments do not involve high-speed collisions and high temperatures that seek to replicate the first moments of the Big Bang. To the opposite. They are low temperature, low energy experiments designed for detecting dark matter interacting with solids and liquids. And those would be germanium crystals, liquid argon, CF3I, and capacitors, which are called charge-coupled devices. Most experiments test the theory that dark matter is composed of WIMPs. And all the experiments to be carried out at Snow Lab follow the same simple detection principle. Quote, a WIMP scatters off a nucleus like a billiard ball, and the recoiling nucleus leaves a tiny energy deposit in the detector, end quote. So of course, this description of the detection has a form of Newton's laws of motion, which remains the basis for our descriptions of how solid things affect each other. But there is a difference in that, because the focus is not on the exterior movement, the dislocation in space of the WIMP and the thing that it's going to touch, if it exists, but the focus is on the internal movement, that is on the change in the material composition of that which is used to detect the particle. But explicitly, the tiny energy deposit, which is to be captured as electrical charge, a phonon, as ultraviolet light, or as bubble signals. So this is the big image of the experiment. So, and it's important to highlight that the shift here, that is a movement, that is an expected dislocation or change in the composition, that it's physical, but that is also a change of composition, that is a change in terms of of energy, right? It's a change in the very presentation of the energy. That's not about just dislocation, things moving in space. But anyway, but precisely this departure from our common understanding of interactions involving material things, whether those are solid, liquid, gases, or plasma, this is what interests me. So an interesting question to me is what becomes thinkable and knowable, and in what ways, if instead of an image of existence that figures material things in the Newtonian way, that is the one that focuses on the external event of interaction, which can be formally, mathematically described, the focus is placed on how the event also includes an alteration of the elemental composition of that which is involved. And as such, also of the composition of the context within which the event takes place. So it's not only the thing that changes, but as the thing changes, everything changes in there. So even though it's not perceptible outside of the lab and its effects are not felt, talking about dark matter, they occur in precisely in that which does the feeling, as it happens at that elemental, atomic, or quantic level, right? So it is happening. What if then humans went about daily existence also attending to such be decompositions that happen all the time, such as what is operated by cosmic rays and other sources of radiation that reach Earth every day? So what if our image of the sensible included this elemental level of materiality where things touch and even decompose or recompose one another, but none of it is felt? That is, they are both invisible and imperceptible. One points to the intangible and touch. Some things are taken for granted and have been so for such a long time that most of us do not even think that there is a question to be asked about them. One of such things, visibility, kinds of things, visibility is perhaps the most ubiquitous and in the least challenged. Far from the famous saying about a tree falling in the forest and denunciations of injustice done, in the key statements on the aesthetic and the very phrase dark matter, visibility, the presumption of visibility goes unchallenged. Visibility is presupposed in the description of dark matter as something that does not interact with the electromagnetic spectrum. It is not visible, that is detectable or sensed, not at the lowest level, radio, not at the highest frequency, gamma rays. What dark matter experiments suggest, as it forces departure from this taken for grantedness of visibility, is an approach to sensibility that would still attend to the abstract. It would retain an interest in the figural or compositional, but place the haptic and the sonic on the same level as the optic. That is an approach to the sensible that does not disavow or submit matter to form or touch to image. The description of the super CDMS, super cryogenic dark matter search experiment, is perhaps on closer investigation, if you pay attention to it, the least straightforward, while it is apparently the simpler of the 7 experiments to be held at Snow Lab. So the description goes like this, quote, taking place deep underground. Once underway, the detector's task will be to capture the minute crystal lattice vibrations, phonons, and ionization charge generated within the detector crystal by elastic collision between detector nuclei and low mass dark matter particles, end quote. So those would be the WIMPs. So the energy deposited in a detector by an interacting dark matter, continuing the description, may be as low as a few tens of electron volts, end quote. sorry, maybe as low as a few tens of electron volts, end quote. Basically, this experiment consists in detecting the changes as a shift in the crystal's composition, that is a generation of a phonon, which is an excitation, and of an electron, which comes from ionization, by a collision with a very large WIMPs. So the detector is not designed to make the WIMPs visible, but to gather what happens when it touches solid matter. Ranked lower among the lowest players in knowledge, the senses, the haptic, the lowest among the lower players in knowledge, so the lowest among the senses. The haptic up to now is the only mode of perceiving that which makes up something that it's everywhere, including in the very cold chambers located 2 kilometers underground. Those are the chambers in the snow lab, and which constitutes between 23 and 20% or 27% of the known universe, meaning dark matter. Now it turns out that if we want to know in the classic ways the stuff that makes up this planet and the cosmos, we need to figure out ways to feel when touched by it. If, on the other hand, we wish to take into account as part of our existence that which we do not feel, then we need an image of existence that takes into account that which happens but cannot be apprehended by our bodily and technological tools for learning. So what I'm saying that we need to be satisfied with the possibility that something exists and happens because it is expressed as in the form of gravitational effects without any assignable cause. So it's not only about something that is imperceptible, but something that is happens through, that's given by its effects. Okay, 1.3, the coarsest and the noblest. What image of existing and knowing would this allow, right? To take, as we take that into account. So in order to identify the point of departure, let me recall two aspects of the Kantian program that still inform how we go about knowing and appreciating what happens and what exists. On the one hand, it's borrowing from Newton's version of classical physics, in particular the centrality of the optic and the very description of the most basic conditions of possibility of knowledge, the formal pure intuitions of space and time, which corresponds to Newton's absolute space and absolute time. In Kant's framework for cognition, they play a similar role as they do in Newton's presentation of the laws of motion, time and the idea of succession, and space and the idea of separation. The first gives a sense of something that remains in spite of changes, while the other gives the possibility of separating that which changes from its context. More importantly, the pure intuitions of space and time are the fundamental conditions for scientific knowledge because they are the conditions of possibility for sensible experience. So recall that science knowledge for him is not interested in knowing the thing in itself, but it's only interested in it as phenomena, as they appear already apprehended by the senses after being organized, separated, and unified by space and time. That is, without these intuitions that reside in the mind of subjectivity, knowledge that can meet the criterion of logical validity would not be possible. On the other hand, I also here have in mind Kant's positioning of the aesthetic judgment or reflective judgment in terms of an agreement between what exists, the imagination, and the understanding. And more importantly, that the feeling of the beautiful arises from judgment that finds in the form, not in its content, substance, matter, in the form of the object, an agreement with the capacities of the understanding, which is recognized by the imagination. So consistently, this privileging of the formal in the philosophical and mathematical sense in the very formulation of aesthetic corresponds to the privileging of vision in relationship to knowledge. And I'm quoting a longish quote of Kant here. The sense of sight, he postulates, even if it is not more indispensable than that of hearing, is still the noblest because among all the senses, It is furthest removed from the sense of touch, the most limited condition of perception. It not only has the widest sphere of perception in space, but also its organs feels at least affected. So it feels least affected because otherwise it would not be merely sight. The sight comes nearer to being a pure intuition, the immediate representation of the given object without admixture of noticeable sensation. End quote. That is, of course, nothing new in this celebration of the object as a sense that best resembles abstraction. So Plato's Allegory of the Cave attests to this defining role in Western epistemology. But let me just again repeat and considering things together. So the privileging of the object and its relation to the significance of form. So in just those are images from the exhibition, by the way. There are very few of them. But so in the scientific, the relations between the privileging of the object and the significance of form. So here it's both in the sense of the logical form, the comes up a priori, but then also appears in the notion of pure intuition of space, which allows for physically separating the things that exist, so which are the object of scientific knowledge. In the static, so form refers to the logical form, the principle of purposiveness of nature, which is transcendental a priori, and also to physical form, right? The shape of the object and of the object of judgments. And I'm mentioning this because I want to remind us the connection between the two. In both cases, the slippage between the logical form and the physical form, and I'll call it the physical form format, signals what is perhaps a purposive ambiguity, but which is more interesting to exploit in terms of Kant's equivalence of sight and the logical form, which gives the formal de priori and the pure. Now, dark matter experiments rely precisely on what for Kant is a lower sense, the lowest, touch. This sense, he postulates, and I'm quoting, is also the only one of immediate external perception. And for this very reason, it is also the most important and most reliably instructive. But nevertheless, it is the coarsest because the matter whose surface is to inform us about the shape of the object through touching must be solid. End quote. Again, ambiguity rules, but it is not difficult to smooth things out by comparing Kant's description of touch, the coarsest, and sight, the noblest, and of course, his statement that sight, I quote, is the furthest removed from the sense of touch. The significance of the object is given in the very definition of the subject matter of the aesthetic, defined as a kind of judgment, as the beautiful and the sublime. In any event, visual references are so prevalent in the critique of the power of judgment that it's not even fun to mention them, to isolate them. 1.4, the cosmic and in the quantic. So what interests me in the experiments carried out at Snow Lab, in particular the super CDMS, is what's suggested by the procedures and the subject, and what it suggests, by the procedures that subject the object to the haptic. When considered cosmically, which is how it's being directly observed, the invisibility of dark matter is given by its effects on large visible existence. The structure of galaxy clusters and events, the bending of light. That's so because dark matter is not observable as a body moving in space, in time, that is something with a position, direction, or velocity. Unlike the visible objects of classical physics, it is observable by what it does to something else as an existence that alters space-time, but not by how it does so. When considered atomically, which is how it will also be indirectly detected, however, it is hoped that invisible dark matter, which is present right here on Earth, will be given by its effects on at the quantic level. Supersede the CMS, for instance, assumes that dark matter will cause a vibration of the crystal lattice manifested in the release of a phonon and the displacing of an electron, both of which are tangible haptic events, that is, alterations in the composition of the detector felt as vibration, as sound in the case of the phonon, or sound-like, and or as heat, heat-like in the case of the electron, or as sound or heat-like in the case of phonon, or as electricity in the case of the electron. Both manifestations of dark matter, the cosmic and the quantic, I find, depart from thinking in the Kantian terms that organize our common sense. So let me return to the abstract character of the visible, which renders it, according to Kant, the important superior sense. The connection between visuality and the possibility of a pure level of cognition is more explicit in his description of the power of judgment, which is the effective moment in cognition, the logic, and also in appreciation, the aesthetic. More precisely, in the statement regarding the a priori condition for judgment, which is the principle of the purposiveness of nature and the law of specification of nature, which combined establish that there is an order in nature which can be uncovered by the understanding. Precisely this statement, which in a way renders the aesthetic subject to logic by occupying what exists and what happens with an order based on differentiation, that is, one that is captured by the laws of logic, the principle of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the principle of the excluded middle. So precisely this statement also accounts for the interiorizing of the sense of sensibility, for its being hijacked and apprehended by subjectivity. In short, Kant links the aesthetic to a mental feeling of pleasure, of life, he calls it, which comes from the realization that there is an order in nature that is adequate to human understanding. What I'm after is something that departs from the subjective, and strays out of the Kantian bounds in at least two ways. First, while retaining the abstract character of sense that sensing acquires in his description of the aesthetic experience, we could replace in the exercise the optic with the haptic. Second, instead of naming it an experience, we could call it for what it is, a mental presentation, an image of what exists and what happens, which, in addition to take into account the visible aspects of whatever is contemplated, also consider that which does not pertain to the domain of vision or form. We could consider the aesthetic with reference to content or substance or matter. That which, insofar as the human body is able to capture, would be sensed as haptic and as sonic. That is, that would manifest as vibration. That possibility I find suggested in the super CDMS experiment, which seeks to detect matter through the setting up of a contact that takes place at the quantic level by observing what happens to the crystal lattice, also at the quantic level, phonons and electron displacement. The displacement means phonons and electrons when the lattice is touched by dark matter particles. Heat and sound would be central to this aesthetic, for which I propose the name of material in a direct contrast to the Kantian formal aesthetic. Now, such formulation would be at once speculative and figurative, but probably not contemplative. That is, it considers the invisible, but not of the order of ungraspable because of extrinsic, the cosmic, but of ungraspable because of intrinsic, the quantic. As such, it is about what is physically perceptible, that is the sensible. Like anything perceptible through the senses, the impossibility of knowing this unknown, and there is no reason to believe that it is a particle anyway, this unknown that constitutes what's called dark matter, requires contact, connection, and the disturbing of a composite. For this reason, this must remain a speculative exercise. Just in case it bears repeating, if it is not yet evident that I'm not proposing a program built on lab findings. I'm interested in how, oh my goodness, sorry. I'm interested, sorry, I have to do this. Then I can, okay, now it's gone. I'm interested in the how of the investigation and what becomes thinkable when scientific procedures are to adapt to something that goes against physics and our common sense. In short, the speculative exercise I propose takes what is said to belong in the sensible to the arena of the possible, but not necessarily actualizable, and from there into the realm of the imaginable and the thinkable. The experiments at Snow Lab postulate a material existence that does not present as something extended, such as a body, as something directly observable as moving in space and time, and that does not interact with light, which is a counterintuitive proposition. What can be sensed is actual, not, however, in the case of dark matter, as it violates common sense in two ways. First, it is sensible if indirectly through its gravitational effects, bending of light, etc. And second, because it does not interact with light and at any frequency and does not take any of the shapes of matter, so it's not. It is not sensible at all. Insofar as it is anything, it is an effect without a known cause. It is this cause that lab experiments seek, but only as a possibility. It could be that the effect is not caused by matter at all. That possible particle will become actual. The experiment setup assumes if its contact with known matter is captured, not through direct observation of it, but only of the decomposition of the known matter, the detector, that is again, it is a cause graspable in its effect. Precisely this speculative aspect of what are presented as sensitive occurrences, I find, allows for taking dark matter straight from the sensible to the arena of the imaginable without passing through the actual. Fantasy and artworks, for instance, may refer to sensations and tease the imagination without prior actual experimentation. There is no reason to deny that WIMPs, insofar as they are theoretical mathematical constructs, could as well be treated as fantastic creatures or artistic objects. What neither exhibits, in contrast to dark matter, are the indirect sensible effects that lead to the speculation of its existence, or well, who knows, maybe they do. Dark matter is neither fantastic nor artistic. It's not a mental creation, but it is a name for the unknown cause of effects that admit no other explanation thus far. As such, dark matter exists as a tangible possibility in the realm of speculation. And precisely this tangibility, which is embodied in the detection methods, offers the event, the sensing, and not the idea of dark matter to the imagination, without the imposition that it and the events indicating its existence be graspable by the tools of the Kantian understanding. Thank you for your patience. So lower than I thought I would be.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Professor Da Silva. So Becca and I have prepared some questions, which I'll begin with. Given this series' emphasis on being time sensitive, which your talk has made me realize just how Kantian, how many Kantian associations there are with that kind of phrase, we like to begin with an invitation to whoever comes with us to think more directly about time. And we were hoping that you could talk more about how time or temporal practices might figure into a material aesthetic. And I'm thinking to also kind of be specific here, I'm thinking that one thing that you've mentioned in your talk is how for Kant and for the Kantian protocol, time organizes sense, and that might not be true necessarily on a quantum level. But I'm wondering too, if we're thinking about experimenting with certain violations of those Kantian principles, is there a way to sense time as well? Could we think of additional ways to sense time? Could we think of it in ways that are not already organized by what time would see, what Kant would see as a sequential time? So more generally, how do you see time working into material practices? And then maybe perhaps also within this context of how do we relate that to Kant's notion of time?
Thank you for both of you for the question, and thanks Ethan for asking it. I was working on a paper which was more explicitly about time, and I was trying to figure out if we can identify in like in the common sense, or maybe even in popular art, artistic or media products, some other presentations of time that that are not Kantian. And I didn't finish the exercise because I gave up in doing this, but I started by thinking about two films, Interstellar and Tenet. And so Interstellar is also obviously so much about time, but then what called my attention in the film is this when they are already visiting the planets, and then they kind of run out of time, or they're going to run out of time, and they say time is a resource. And that's like, wow, the fall of time. Time became just like, any other thing that is a resource. And maybe this is true, right? Because our time being used in these, with these machines in this media, maybe time is now also and only a resource. And Tenet, it's not, time is not a resource, but time is a more Kantian. Yeah, it's more Kantian, more Newtonian, in the sense that it is something that seems to be there as things are inverted, right? You can go back and forth in time. Things can go back and forth in time. Not the same way, the inverted things that move against time, they are more dangerous, whatever. So I didn't finish the exercise. I think maybe I will finish, and I'll actually watch the films again and see what's happening there. But so the sequentiality is, it kind of seems to not have much importance in time as a resource. And it's fundamental in time, in Tenet's time, in time as some context within which things can move in a way or the other ways. Now, these are renderings of time as something exterior, right? As a context within which some things happen. Now, one of the problems in maybe that I see as an impediment in trying to rescue time from the Kantian program, and the Hegelian and phenomenology and everything that follows, like all those tools we use for thinking, is that if we take time out of it, something will happen to subjectivity, because time is only crucial to the limitation of the position that is occupied by that form, that thing, which is subjectivity. So I'm afraid, that's why I end up always back to the end of time. I'm afraid time would not survive that unless it's translated back into the Newtonian context, or it becomes something that is separate like the other things. You see, so, and when I say that, I don't mean that then time doesn't exist. Well, McTaggart, they all have that question, so whether or not time exists or does not exist outside of it's figuring in the subject. But I think it doesn't, it doesn't go beyond becoming a thing, like what happens as a register of thing in the case of the super CDMS, that if the WIMP hits the detector and the phonon and an electron are released, then you have the composition before and the composition after. But even there, time is not the most important thing, right? The transformation is not something that takes place in time. It's something that takes place because of that, because that touching came about. So yeah, I don't think that there is anything to be gained by approaching time as a resource. And it seems that this objectification of time or similar objectifications of time may be the only way of releasing it from the subject, even though it becomes an object of desire or an object for, commerce. I don't know.
Yeah, I was during your talk, I coincidentally had watched Interstellar just a few nights ago. So during your talk, when you were talking about gravity in that movie, gravity is one of the few things that can transcend the sort of time space, barrier. That's how the movie produces its logic. So it was interesting to see those two things, Lisa, and then to hear you mention it. I guess to follow on the Kant question as well, I was wondering if maybe you could also speak a little bit more how you see like inner sense working in this way, in the sense, and when I'm saying that is that inner sense is something that is not haptic, it's not visual, it doesn't actually have those kinds of qualities. Its inner sense is when we can register changes in our moods, it's when we register internal changes and we can feel them. It's not really, it doesn't correspond easily to any sort of the kind of senses that we have now, that we imagine that we have now, the five senses. So I guess I'm wondering, do you see inner sense in some ways related to a sort of perhaps a way of also kind of getting out of the sort of domination of the visual in some ways? I know this inner sense is a Kantian term, but I'm wondering if there's some power of that term that gets kind of falls away, perhaps in the critique of judgment, that is more present in pure reason or something else.
Yeah, so inner sense, but because inner sense also is so much, in the context of time, because it requires that a certain unity, right? The unity of self-consciousness given as in its persistence. So it's not about perception, right? It's not the time of things or the time of what happens or the time of that which exists, that it's not subjectivity, but it is its capacity to recognize itself as such. Now, I think I think one possibility of taking inner sense out of time, right? Out of this, it would require, if we take inner sense out of time, and yet we should give it a significance in terms of delimiting a certain position where where a human or something else can be recognized as a singular composite. With taking it out of time, I think it is possible, but then there is a matter of emphasis on what happens and what takes place at that moment, right? I'm just thinking like a little craziness, right? We have to let go of the demand for unity at that level for coherence, right? And then different things happen that would happen in terms of, for instance, the significance of memory, of remembering as crucial to the human in the ways in which the human exists. So what would be the advantage, one can ask, of retaining the inner sense without temporality? It might be like, this is a bit silly, but there may be something about becoming just a detector or describing human existence in that sense of being just a detector, something that is altered somehow by something else that exists and happens, but that retains some degree of coherence that doesn't need to be exactly identical, but it's not seen as a change that is in a process of evolution or devolution at the same time. So that might be possible, and that might, be a way of, but be a point of departure for descriptions of human existence that are more kinder to everything else, including our conditions of existence, meaning the planet. So if really the effects of global warming, if they really matter to me, right? I mean, if we did not to me individual, but if we did not bet on the possibility of finding a solution so as we could minimize the effects of global warming, right? And that's a solution that is found in time and through technology. If we really believed that once this shift has taken place, like these different moments of the shift, they have taken place, the planet has changed in such a way that it is no longer, it's not no longer, comfortable to be inhabited by humans, but by everything else. And if that really mattered to me, then in the sense the me being, the person referring to herself in that context and how she exists as, think about the inner sense, right? This gives me the sense of my existence. If we could describe that such a condition, so then, then it would be, now that would be a huge transformation in how we make sense and explain and justify, and also how we make demands for anything that's related or designed for addressing these other global crises, the global warming. But as I was trying to say, but that means losing some sense of human integrity that is given by our separation from everything else, on the one hand, and also at the same time, maybe a sense of the human existing so immediately. I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying, but I think there is a shift. Inner sense without time requires breaking with the demand for integrity of that thing, and then at the same time tending to what is happening in any given moment immediately.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think for me, that's really helpful because the kind of placing the inner sense not only with or asking of the inner sense not only to give up time, but to also give up unity, in the sense that how can we also have, and the way of framing this is, to me, is my mind would be something like, what would an inner sense look like that is not just of the sort of just of the I, when we think of the inner sense of just my enclosed body, and it doesn't just have to be I have an inner sense and you have an inner sense, and everyone has their own individual inner senses, but that instead, can we think of a sort of more unseparated inner sense that is not kind of individuals, each with the same exact inner sense, but under different conditions. So it's definitely an experiment to think in that direction, which is really interesting that I haven't considered.
That's what I'm playing with when I'm thinking with dark matter, the imaginable, that imaginable, that it is imperceptible, it is material, it is imperceptible, it's possible, can be imaginable, doesn't need to happen, right? And existing already as being a singular, but at the same time as an effect of all those other things, right? In the case dark matter is good as an example because it is a thing that it's not visible anyway. When you talk about visible matter, the things that happen as from global warming, then there is a separation in there, right? So that's why I was fascinated when I was reading about the experiments, like, oh my God, if we could only exist in our imagination, right? Hence plays out in the inner, in regard to the inner sense. So if we could only exist by taking that into account, without any proof, without anything, just because it might be happening, it does happen. Because it does happen, something happens.
We have one last question, which is thinking about history as another way of talking about time. Is there an aesthetic materialism that rivals or supplements or disrupts the practices of a traditional historical materialism? I'm thinking here also just of your critiques of historical materialism, especially in regards to problems of sequentiality that kind of can come up in there as well. So I'm wondering, when you think of aesthetic materialism, are you also thinking of historical materialism? Are those not things that you're connecting? In my mind, that was one of the resonances possibly, and also hearing that term come up elsewhere in your work, I was wondering if there are places for it here.
It does. Well, in the engagements with historical materialism, I call it raw materialism, right? And it's both a joke and it's not a joke. But raw materialism, because make the case for or a case against the distinction between the subject of production and that which is subjected to it, right? So the labor as the active subject, that the agent of production, and then the land and everything else. Means of production, raw materials as being subject to it. So raw materialism, the materialist in raw materialism is related to that. And this is something that I actually do elaborate. Your question is one that I do answer in Unpayable Debt, the book. That's why I can't answer it now, because it took me all kinds of movements to do that. But let me just say that I think the critique that, okay, so the aesthetic aspect, the ways in which the critique of historical materialism and these notes towards this thing I'm calling aesthetic, material statics, they meet in the focus on redecomposition as this as a material capacity, and then if that is the case, right? If becoming something else, not becoming in the sense of becoming, but the becoming in the sense of its shifting format is intrinsic, is what defines the material, we can do two things. Number one, as I was saying before, eliminate that distinction between labor and the things on the one hand, and then at the same time thinking materially of labor insofar as it is a force. And then of course I'm totally speaking within the same knowledge program, not departing from anything here. But labor insofar as it is a force, meaning insofar as it is something that changes potential energy into kinetic energy, then it also, and I think Marx and others say it all the time, though not literally, but I'm saying it literally. The body that works on the things and on the instruments, it also transfers itself to that which it produces, even as it will be transduced into more abstract things like capital, money, and other different measures of value. So at the core is the same thing, but I'm just going to give you the two pieces and then we can connect it some other time.
Thank you very much. It gives us something to look forward to. So thank you very much. And that will be the end of our talk for tonight for everyone who's watching. Thank you, Professor Da Silva, and thank you for everyone who's joined. And thank you to the Kelly Writers House for supporting this event.
Thank you again. Thank you for your questions. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Becca.